therapist in Tampa, Florida, with Whitford Thomas Group, speaking to you today about how to test for borderline personality disorder. It's an interesting question because borderline personality disorder is one of many personality disorders. In my opinion, borderline personality disorder tends to be a little more extreme.
He is the one that's crazy. He's the one that drives me crazy. There's nothing wrong with me. He put his finger in my cereal, my Fruity Pebbles. I can't stand them anymore. I hate them. There ain't nothing wrong with me, doctor. It's him.
He said I wasn't
it's him.
Psychotic.
A borderline personality.
We do not have split personalities. We have no personality.
How they see the world.
I'll get up right now and kick your ass.
Often driven by
I'll fucking power drive you. Put you in a Boston Crab.
Dire need for love.
You know it too.
Comfort, things of that sort. If we look at from a feeling level of borderline personality disorder, usually a very high level of anxiety.
Doctor,
depression, but we tend to see much more anger and anxiety with borderline personality.
That's not me, man.
If we look at the next area of behavior, oftentimes borderline personality disorders, behavior is very exaggerated, very poor boundaries, a lot of risk-taking, a lot of
you better quit.
Kind of what we might call unusual, peculiar type behavior. And finally,
you don't want to come here.
Other 4 life processes.
You never want to listen to me.
About thinking. Now, thinking with borderline personality disorders tends to be highly irrational. It doesn't mean that people think irrationally all the time.
We can go and
but their irrational thinking is very.
We can kick this doctor's ass.
So under normal circumstances,
come on, man, let's get out of here.
Respond in kind of a unusual type of way to stressors and things of that sort.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is the difference between borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder? Now, this is a question that I've received many times, and these two particular diagnoses are very easy to confuse with one another. Specifically, bipolar 2 is even easier to confuse with borderline personality disorder than bipolar 1. So let's take a look at these two disorders briefly. If we consider borderline personality disorder, first of all, that's a cluster B personality disorder. Bipolar disorder is not a personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by several different symptoms: a fear of abandonment, unstable relationships, this love-hate cycle. It's a cycle of idealization and devaluation that occurs in relationships, mood swings, suicidal ideation or suicidal behavior, anger or irritability, paranoia, depersonalization, which is a type of dissociation, and impulsiveness. So those are some of the main symptoms for borderline personality disorder. If it sounds a lot like bipolar disorder, that's because it is. If we look at bipolar disorder, specifically bipolar 1, we see that there's 2 main features. Depression, a major depressive episode, which would involve hopelessness and sometimes fatigue, as well as many other symptoms, and mania, which would involve a great deal of energy and euphoria, as well as other symptoms, including, with both mania and depression, the potential of delusions, the potential of psychotic symptoms. So when we look at these two disorders together, borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder, the strongest overlap we see is with impulsiveness, the lower self-esteem, that's a feature of both these disorders, unstable mood, recklessness, irritability, potential suicidal ideation or behavior, and paranoia. Now again, we'd only expect to see the paranoia with bipolar disorder at one of the 2 extremes, at the very low of depression or the very high of mania. And many individuals with bipolar disorder do not have psychotic symptoms, only some do. But still, this is a wide area of overlap. And when assessing somebody for borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder, it can be really easy to confuse these 2 disorders. So what does differentiate borderline personality disorder from bipolar disorder? What symptoms can we use to tell these 2 apart? Well, this is actually fairly tricky. One of the areas that I see in this discussion is that the abandonment fear is something that's unique to borderline personality disorder that you wouldn't see in bipolar. Generally, I think that's true, but when somebody has depression, particularly, it's not unusual that they have a fear of abandonment. Now, we would expect, of course, that abandonment fear to be much more pronounced with borderline personality disorder. So in general, I think this is an area that we can say we would expect to see this in borderline personality disorder, and it's not typically seen in bipolar disorder. Another area we see with this is the idea of stress and relationships, meaning that a stressor in the context of a relationship tends to cause an exacerbation of symptoms in borderline personality disorder, and it does not tend to cause an exacerbation of symptoms in bipolar disorder. So a lot of the symptoms in borderline personality disorder are thought to be triggered by difficulties in relationships, by a relationship-related stressor. Now again, this can occur in bipolar, but we do typically think of this as being a feature of borderline personality disorder. When you look to see when the most severe symptom manifestations occur, if they happen right after a relational stressor, that is an indication that points more toward borderline than bipolar. Another area we see of differentiation is the idea that chronic emptiness is something that you see primarily in borderline personality disorder. And again, here we have to exercise caution, as with this whole area of these two disorders, because chronic emptiness can occur in a major depressive episode and bipolar. Now, you could argue that it wouldn't be really chronic because someone's going to cycle out of a major depressive episode, and with borderline personality disorder, that's more of a constant mood. We would not expect to see the cyclic nature in borderline personality disorder. So when we say chronic emptiness, there'd be more of an emphasis there on chronic. You're going to see emptiness really in both presentations. Now, I mentioned the cyclic nature of bipolar, and this is another area where we could use this type of pattern to differentiate the two disorders. What we expect with bipolar disorder is a period of months where we see a major depressive episode, and then after that it could be another major depressive episode or a manic episode. Similarly, if you observe a manic episode first, it could be followed by another manic episode or a major depressive episode, but we do expect that in between there'd be this area of relatively normal mood. This isn't always the case for every presentation of bipolar disorder, but usually the mood stabilizes a bit in the middle. With borderline personality disorder, we don't see that. It's a persistent mood disturbance, so we wouldn't expect to see periods where the symptoms tend to go away. Another potential way to differentiate between the two disorders is to consider what we'd expect to see typically with bipolar versus borderline personality disorder in terms of moods. With bipolar disorder, we tend to think of this as involving mostly depression, elation, and moving back and forth between depression and elation. With borderline personality disorder, we would expect to see more anger, anxiety, aggressiveness, mood reactivity, impulsivity, and irritability. Now again, you could see all these symptoms with both disorders. It's about where we'd expect to see these symptoms more often. Now it's important to note that, as I mentioned, differentiating these two disorders is difficult. They also have a fairly high co-occurrence, meaning that if somebody has borderline personality disorder, they're more at risk to have bipolar disorder. These two disorders sometimes run together. This is called comorbidity. Also, if somebody has bipolar disorder, they're at increased risk to have borderline personality disorder. So again, with this comorbidity, with this co-occurrence of these two disorders, it only makes it more difficult to differentiate them. Now you may wonder why I indicated that bipolar 2 is harder to tell apart from borderline personality disorder than bipolar 1 is. So with bipolar 1, we don't have hypomania like we see with bipolar 2. We have what we refer to as mania. And with mania, a lot of times an individual will stay up for several days at a time. They'll have a tremendous amount of energy, and there'll really be a pronounced recklessness. and euphoria. We don't typically see this in the same episodic way with borderline personality disorder, which again means that bipolar 1 is a little easier to differentiate from borderline personality disorder than is bipolar 2. When we lose that mania and replace it with hypomania, bipolar 2 looks a lot more like borderline personality disorder, becomes a lot easier to confuse. I hope you found this description of borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder to be interesting. Thanks for watching.